For rich kids, the nightmare spell was a golden ticket. For a slum rat with no family, it was an execution date.
A frail-looking young man, pale skin, dark circles carved under his eyes, sat on a rusty bench across from the police station. He cradled a cup of coffee in both hands. Not the cheap, synthetic sludge slum rats like him could afford, the real thing, plant-based coffee, the kind usually reserved for higher-ranked citizens, and it had swallowed most of his savings. But today, Sonny had decided to spoil himself. After all, his life was ending. Soaking in the warmth of that luxurious drink, he lifted the cup and breathed in the aroma. Then, carefully, he took a small sip, and immediately grimaced. Ah, so bitter! He glared at the cup like it had personally betrayed him, sighed, and forced down another mouthful. Bitter or not, he was getting his money's worth, taste buds be damned. I should have bought a piece of real meat instead. Who knew actual coffee is so disgusting? Well, it's going to keep me awake at least. He stared off into the distance, drifting, eyelids sinking, then slapped himself across the face to snap out of it. Tch, what a ripoff. Shaking his head and muttering curses, Sonny drained the cup and got to his feet. Rich people from this part of the city streamed past the little park on their way to work, throwing him strange looks. Haggard, sleep-deprived, unhealthily thin and pale, dressed in cheap clothes. Yeah, he stuck out here like a stain. Also, everyone seemed so tall. Watching them with a pinch of envy, he tossed the cup toward a garbage bin. I guess that's what 3 full meals a day would do to you. The cup missed by a mile and rolled across the ground. Sonny rolled his eyes, walked over, picked it up, and dropped it neatly into the trash. Then, with a faint grin, he crossed the street and stepped into the police station. Inside, a tired-looking officer flicked a glance at him and frowned with open distaste. Are you lost, boy? Sonny looked around, curious, noting the reinforced armor plates lining the walls and the turret nests badly hidden in the ceiling. The officer looked scruffy and mean, too. At least police stations stayed the same wherever you went. Hey, I'm talking to you. Sonny cleared his throat. No. Then he scratched the back of his head and added, As demanded by the 3rd Special Directive, I am here to surrender myself as a carrier of the nightmare spell. The officer's face flipped from annoyed to wary in an instant. He looked the young man over again, this time with piercing intensity. Are you sure you are infected? When did you start showing symptoms? Sonny shrugged. A week ago? The officer went visibly pale. Shit. Then his hand shot to the terminal, slammed a button, and he bellowed, Attention! Code black in the lobby! I repeat, code black! The nightmare spell first appeared in the world a few decades ago. Back then, the planet was only beginning to crawl back from a string of devastating natural disasters and the resource wars that followed. At first, nobody paid much attention to the strange new illness that had millions of people complaining about endless fatigue and sleepiness. But when those people began sinking into an unnatural slumber, still out cold days later, with no sign of waking, governments finally panicked. By then, of course, it was far too late. Not that reacting sooner would have changed a thing, and when the infected started dying in their sleep, their corpses twisting into monsters, no one was ready. Nightmare creatures tore through national armies like paper, dragging the world into total chaos. Nobody knew what the spell was, what it wanted, how to fight it. In the end, it was the awakened, the ones who survived the spell's first trials and came back breathing, who finally stopped the slaughter. Armed with miraculous abilities won inside their nightmares, they brought back peace and built something resembling a new order. And that was only the first of the catastrophes the spell would bring. But as far as Sonny was concerned, none of it had anything to do with him. Not until a few days ago, anyway, when he first started having trouble staying awake. For an average person, being chosen by the spell was equal parts death sentence and golden ticket. Kids learned survival skills and combat techniques in school, just in case they got infected. Wealthy families hired private tutors to drill their children in every martial art under the sun. Those born into the Awaken clans had it even better. Powerful legacies, inherited memories and echoes to wield on their very first trip into the dream realm. The richer your family, the better your odds of surviving and becoming awakened. But Sonny had no family to speak of, and spent most of his days scrounging for food instead of sitting in a classroom. For him, being chosen by the spell offered no opportunity whatsoever. For him, it was simply a death sentence. A few minutes later, Sunny was yawning while several policemen busied themselves strapping him down. Soon he was fastened into a bulky chair that looked like a strange cross between a hospital bed and a torture device. The room sat in the basement of the police station, thick armored walls, and a vault door that looked like it could stop a tank. More officers lined the walls, automatic rifles in their hands, grim expressions on their faces. Sunny couldn't bring himself to care about any of them. The only thought in his head was how badly he wanted to sleep. At last, the vault door swung open and a gray-haired policeman stepped inside. Weathered face, stern eyes, the look of a man who had seen far too many terrible things. He checked the restraints, glanced quickly at his wristwatch, then turned to Sunny. "What's your name, kid?" Sunny blinked a few times, dragging his focus back, then shifted uncomfortably. "Sunless." The old policeman raised an eyebrow. "Sunless? That's a strange name." Sunny tried to shrug and discovered he couldn't move at all. "What's so strange about it? At least I have a name. Back in the outskirts, not everyone even gets one." Another yawn, then he added, "I was born during a solar eclipse. My mom had a poetic soul, you see." That's how he ended up with that weird-ass name, and how his little sister got called Rain, back when she still lived with them at least. Whether it came from poetic imagination or plain laziness, he never found out. The old policeman grunted. "Do you want me to contact your family?" Sunny just shook his head. "There's no one. Don't bother." For a second, something dark crossed the policeman's face. Then his expression hardened. "All right, Sunless, how long can you stay awake?" Not long." The policeman sighed. "Then we don't have time for the full procedure. Fight it off as long as you can and listen to me very carefully, okay?" He didn't wait for an answer. "How much do you know about the nightmare spell?" Sunny gave him a puzzled look. "As much as anyone, I guess? Who doesn't know about the spell?" "Not the fancy stuff from the dramas and the propaganda broadcasts. I mean, how much do you really know?" That one was hard to answer. "Don't I just go into the dream realm, kill a few monsters to finish the first nightmare, get magic powers and become an awakened?" The old policeman shook his head. "Listen carefully. The moment you fall asleep, you'll be pulled inside your first nightmare. Nightmares are trials created by the spell. Once you're in there, you'll meet monsters, sure, but you'll also meet people. Remember this, they're not real. They're illusions conjured up to test you." "How do you know?" The policeman just stared at him. "I mean, nobody understands what the spell is or how it works, right? So how do you know they're not real?" "You might have to kill them, kid. So do yourself a favor and think of them as illusions." "Oh." The old policeman waited a beat, then nodded and went on. "A lot about the first nightmare comes down to luck. As a rule, it shouldn't be impossibly hard. The situation you land in, the tools you get, the creatures you have to put down, all of it should sit somewhere inside the range of your abilities at least. The spell sets up trials, not executions. You're a bit disadvantaged because of, well, your circumstances. But kids from the outskirts are tough. Don't write yourself off just yet." "Uh-huh." Sleep was pulling at Sunny harder and harder. Following the conversation was becoming a chore. "About those magic powers you mentioned. You'll get them, yes, if you survive to the end of the nightmare. What exactly they turn out to be depends on your natural affinity and on what you do during the trial. But some of it will be in your hands right from the start." The old policeman's voice drifted further and further away. Sunny's eyelids were so heavy he could barely hold his eyes open. "Remember, the first thing you do inside the nightmare is check your attributes and your aspect. If you get a combat aspect, a swordsman, an archer, something like that, things will be easier. If it's backed up by a physical attribute, even better. Combat aspects are the most common ones, so your odds are good." The armored room was going dim. If you're unlucky and your aspect has nothing to do with fighting, don't despair. Sorcery and utility aspects have their own uses. You'll just have to be clever about it. There are no truly useless aspects. Well, almost none. So do whatever it takes to survive. If you survive, you'll be halfway to becoming an awakened. But if you die, you'll tear open a gate and a nightmare creature will step through into the real world. which means my colleagues and I get to clean up the mess. So, please, don't die, Sunless. Half asleep already, Sunny found himself oddly touched by the policeman's words. Or at least try not to die right away. The nearest awakened is hours out, so we'd really appreciate it if you didn't leave us to fight that thing on our own. What? And on that last thought, Sunny sank into a deep, heavy slumber. Everything went black. Then, out of the darkness, a faintly familiar voice rang out. Sunny dreamt of a mountain. Jagged and lonesome, it towered over every other peak in the chain, slicing the night sky with its sharp edges. A radiant moon washed its slopes in ghostly, pale light. On one of those slopes, the remains of an old road clung stubbornly to the rock. Here and there, weathered paving stones showed through the snow. To the right of the road, a sheer cliff face rose like an impregnable wall. To the left, a silent black sea of nothingness promised an endless fall. Strong winds hurled themselves against the mountain again and again, screaming in powerless rage. Then, all at once, the moon dropped below the horizon. The sun rose in the west, streaked across the sky, and vanished in the east. Snowflakes leapt off the ground and returned to the embrace of the clouds. Sunny realized he was watching time run backwards. In an instant, hundreds of years flew past. The snow drew back, bearing the old road. A cold shiver crawled down Sunny's spine as he saw human bones scattered across the stones. A moment later, the bones were gone, and in their place a slave caravan appeared, moving backwards down the mountain in a clamor of chains. Time slowed, stopped, and then picked up its usual pace. What the hell is this? Step, step, another step. A dull ache pulsed through Sunny's bleeding feet as he shivered with cold. His threadbare tunic was nearly useless against the biting wind. His wrists were the worst of it. Torn raw by the iron shackles, they shot a sharp pang of pain through him every time the freezing metal brushed his broken skin. What kind of a situation is this? Sunny looked up the road, then down it, and saw a long chain winding along the mountain. Dozens upon dozens of hollow-eyed people, slaves just like him, shackled to it at short intervals. Ahead of him walked a man with broad shoulders and a bloodied back, moving at a steady, measured pace. Behind him, a shifty-looking guy with quick, desperate eyes was cursing quietly under his breath in a language Sunny didn't know, and yet somehow understood. Every so often, armed horsemen in ancient-style armor rode past, throwing menacing looks at the slaves. However you looked at it, things were really bad. Sunny was more bewildered than panicked. True, this was nothing like what first nightmares were supposed to be. Usually, freshly chosen aspirants woke up in a scenario that handed them a fair amount of agency. They'd be members of privileged or warrior castes with plenty of access to weapons, enough to at least take a swing at whatever conflict came their way. Starting out as a powerless slave, shackled, half dead already, was about as far from ideal as anyone could imagine. But the spell was never only about challenge. It was about balance, too. Like the old policeman said, it created trials, not executions. So Sunny was fairly certain that, to make up for such an abysmal start, it would hand him something good in return. A powerful aspect, at the very least. Alright, so how do I do this? Digging up memories of the webtoons he devoured as a kid, Sunny concentrated and turned words over in his head. Status. Myself. Information. Sure enough, the moment he focused, shimmering runes bloomed in the air before him. And once again, though he had never learned this ancient alphabet, the meaning behind it simply arrived, clear as day. He found the rune describing his aspect fast enough, and that was the exact moment his composure fell apart. What? What the actual fuck? Name: Sunless. True name: Sunless. Rank: Aspirant. Soul core: Dormant. Memories: Sun, Echoes, Sun, Attributes, Sun, Sun, Aspect, Sun. Aspect description. Speechless, Sunny stared at the runes, trying to convince himself that his eyes were playing tricks on him. Nobody could be that unlucky, right? No useless aspects my ass. The thought had barely finished forming when he lost the rhythm of his steps, stumbled, and dragged the chain down with his weight. The shifty guy behind him shrieked instantly.
Whores bastard, watch where you're going!
Sunny hurriedly dismissed the runes, visible to no one but him, and fought to get his balance back. A moment later, he was walking steadily again, though not before yanking that chain one more time. "You little shit! I'm going to kill you!" The broad-shouldered man ahead of Sunny chuckled without bothering to turn his head. Why bother? The weakling will be dead by sunrise anyway. The mountain will kill him. A few seconds passed, then he added, "It'll kill you and me too, just a bit later. I really don't know what the Imperials are thinking, forcing us into this cold." The shifty guy gasped, "Speak for yourself, fool! I'm planning to survive." Sunny shook his head in silence and put all his focus into not falling again. What a charming pair. Then a third voice drifted in from somewhere further back. This one was gentle, intelligent. "This mountain pass is usually much warmer this time of year. We just had really bad luck. Also, I would advise you against harming this boy." "Why is that?" Sunny tilted his head slightly, listening. "Haven't you seen the markings on his skin? He is not like us, who fell into slavery due to debts, crimes, or misfortune. He was born a slave. A temple slave, to be precise. Not long ago, the Imperials destroyed the last temple of the Shadow God. I suspect that this is how the boy ended up here." The broad-shouldered man threw a glance back over his shoulder. "So what? Why should we be afraid of a half-forgotten weakling god? He couldn't even save his own temples. The Empire is protected by the mighty war god. Of course they're not afraid to burn down a few temples. But we here are not protected by anything or anyone. Do you really want to risk angering a god?" The broad-shouldered man grunted and left the question hanging. Their talk died the second a young soldier rode up on a beautiful white horse. Simple leather cuirass, a spear, a short sword, and somehow he still managed to look noble and dignified. To Sunny's irritation, the asshole was genuinely pretty too. In a historical drama, this guy would have been the male lead, no contest. What is going on here? No menace in his voice. If anything, something close to concern. Everyone hesitated, so the slave with the gentle voice spoke up. "It's nothing, sir. We are just all tired and cold. Especially our young friend over there. This journey is truly too hard for someone that young." The soldier looked at Sunny with pity. "What are you looking at? You're not much older than me," Sunny thought. Naturally, he kept his mouth shut. The soldier sighed, unhooked a flask from his belt, and held it out to Sunny. "Bear with it a little more, child. We will stop for the night soon. For now, here, drink some water." Child? Child? Thin body, small frame, both courtesy of years of malnourishment, meant people constantly mistook Sunny for someone younger. Usually he milked it for all it was worth. Right now, though, that single word grated on him like sand in a wound. Still, he was really, really thirsty. His fingers were an inch from the flask when a whip cracked through the air and the world exploded into pain. He stumbled, yanking the chain again, earning a curse from the shifty slave behind him. Another soldier, older and considerably angrier, reined in his horse a few paces back. That whip, the one that had split the back of Sunny's tunic and drawn blood, was his. He didn't so much as glance at the slaves. His contempt was aimed entirely at his younger colleague. "What do you think you're doing?" The young soldier's face darkened. "I was just giving this boy some water. He'll receive water with the rest of them once we camp." "But, shut your mouth. These slaves are not your friends. Understood? They're not even people. Treat them like people, and they'll begin imagining things." The young soldier looked at Sunny. Then he lowered his head and hung the flask back on his belt. "Don't let me catch you making friends with slaves again, newbie. Or next time, it will be your back tasting my whip." To drive the point home, the older soldier snapped the whip through empty air and rode past them, trailing threat and fury behind him. Sunny watched him go, malice tucked neatly out of sight. "I don't know how, but I will watch you die first." Then he turned his head toward the younger soldier, drifting back through the column, head still bowed. "And you, second." For a few minutes he stewed in that darkness. Then he dragged himself out of it and pulled in a deep breath, trying to actually enjoy the air. And air like this? You couldn't buy it in the real world. Microdust and pollutants made every breath rough and gritty, never mind the permanent stench hanging over the outskirts. In the nicer districts, elaborate filtration systems hummed away day and night, but filtered air tasted sterile and dead, like breathing inside a sealed jar. Only the truly rich ever got to breathe something pleasant. And here he was, gulping down unlimited amounts of pristine, delicious air, like some second-generation chaebol. Truly, being chosen by the spell has its benefits. If only it weren't so brutally cold, his feet weren't screaming, and his wrists and back weren't pure agony. The slave caravan crawled up the mountain, slower and slower, and more of the slaves were stumbling, dropping to the ground. Twice now, the ones who simply couldn't walk anymore were unhooked from the chain and tossed aside without ceremony, off the road, into the abyss yawning to the left of it. Sunny watched them fall with a faint twinge of compassion. Poor fellows, rest in peace, you pitiful souls. All things considered, he was in a rather good mood. Strange thing, feeling fine in the middle of a disaster like this nightmare. But thankfully, Sunny had already had time to make peace with the idea. When the first symptoms of the spell showed up, he hadn't handled it well at all. Dying before you even turn 17 isn't the kind of thing anyone swallows easily. Still, in the end, it only took him a few days to accept it. He went to visit his parents' makeshift resting place. Well, resting place was generous, since he was too poor to afford even the cheapest slot in the remembrance facility, so it was really just 2 lines carved into an old tree. And he added a 3rd line, for himself. And after that, oddly enough, he felt relaxed. Carefree even. Because really, what was left to worry about? No more scraping for money, hunting for food, watching his back, planning some future he'd never see. When the worst thing that could possibly happen has already happened, what else is there to fear? So becoming a slave and slowly freezing to death wasn't all that much of a shock. Besides, he knew the cold wasn't what would kill him. He'd already glimpsed the fate waiting for this caravan further up the mountain. That image of bones piled across the ground was still burned into his mind. Most likely it was a pack of monsters that would finish the caravan off. And judging by what he'd seen, the attack was coming in a matter of hours, not days. Which meant he still had a chance. So, taking advantage of the moment, Sunny decided to look over his status again and summon the runes. Last time he'd been too outraged by the aspect to study the attributes properly. And while attributes weren't as important as your aspect, they were often the thin line between living and dying. They reflected your natural traits and affinities, and sometimes they even handed you passive abilities and effects. Attribute description. The strings of fate wrap tightly around you. Unlikely events, both good and bad, are drawn by your presence. There are those who are blessed, and there are those who are cursed, but rarely both. Attribute description. You bear a faint scent of divinity, as though someone briefly touched by it once, a long time ago. Attribute description. Shadows recognize you as one of their own. Interesting. It didn't take Sunny long to pin the blame for his whole situation on that first attribute, point. At a glance, it looked like it meant he was destined for something specific, dying miserably and vanishing without a trace, for instance. But reading the description again, he realized being fated simply meant improbable things had a much better chance of happening whenever he was nearby. I guess that explains how I managed to land one of the super rare useless aspects, and a weird variant of it at that. It was the attribute he was born with, then the other 2 came from the aspect. Was simple enough. It was meant to grant passage into certain sacred places within the dream realm and sharpen a few branches of sorcery. Since there wasn't a sacred place anywhere in sight, and Sunny's aspect had nothing whatsoever to do with sorcery, it was just as useless as the rest. Was the odd one out. He'd never heard of it, and he had no clue what it was supposed to do. Not until the sun slipped behind the mountain and the sky started to bleed into darkness. Then, to his surprise, Sunny realized he could see perfectly in the dark, as though it were still the middle of the day. That alone was nothing to sneer at, and who knew, The shadows might yet hand him other gifts he hadn't discovered. Finally, something good. I wonder if... "Stop the caravan! Prepare to camp!" At the head soldier's bark, the slaves halted and dropped to the ground, shivering, spent. The little clearing where the road widened was shielded from the wind by a jutting shoulder of rock, but it was still far too cold for anything resembling rest. The soldiers set to work, herding the slaves into a tight circle to force them to share warmth, then kindling a big bonfire at the center of the camp, though not before seeing to their horses, of course. The heavy wagon carrying food, water, and other cargo, the wagon the main chain was bolted to, was rolled forward to break the wind. Glancing around, Sunny caught sight of the young soldier from earlier, staring up at the mountain with a strange, tangled expression. What a weirdo. Before long, the bonfire was roaring. The stronger slaves elbowed their way closer to the heat, while the weaker ones, Sunny included, were left on the outer rim of the circle, backs freezing in the wind. And naturally, every movement was hampered by the fact that they were still shackled to the chain, which was why the familiar, broad-shouldered slave ended up exactly where he'd started, despite all his shoving toward the flames. "Damn Imperials," he hissed, thoroughly annoyed. The soldiers moved among the slaves, doling out water and food. Sunny, like everyone else, got a few sips of icy water and a small piece of moldy bread hard as a stone. Ugly as it was, he made himself eat every crumb, only to end up just as hungry as before. Judging by the faces around him, he wasn't alone in that. The shifty slave who'd been walking behind him looked around in misery. "By all the gods, they fed me better in the dungeons," he spat on the ground, hopeless. "And most of us innocent men down there were waiting on a trip to the gallows, too." A few steps away, where the paved road ended and jagged rock began, a scattering of bright red berries grew out of the snow. Sunny had spotted them before, clustering here and there along the road, and had even thought how pretty the stubborn little things looked against all that white. The shifty slave's eyes lit up, and he began crawling toward them on all fours. "I would advise against eating those, friend." It was the gentle-voiced slave again. Sunny turned and, for the first time, saw the man in the flesh. Tall, in his 40s, lean and oddly handsome, with the dignified air of a scholar. How someone like that ended up in chains was anyone's guess, and yet, there he was. "You and your advice again. What? Why?" The scholar smiled, almost apologetic. "These berries are called bloodbane. They only grow where human blood has soaked the ground. That's why you'll always find them thick along the slave trade routes." "And? So what?" The older man let out a slow sigh. "Bloodbane is poison. A handful of berries can be enough to kill a grown man." "Curses!" The shifty slave jerked his hand back and shot the scholar a venomous look. Sunny barely noticed either of them, because, glancing around, he'd finally placed it. This camp was the exact spot from his vision at the start of the nightmare, the place where the bones of the slaves lay buried under the snow. And he would have bet anything that whatever had killed them all was about to happen. Soon. As if answering the thought, a thunderous roar tore through the sky above, and a second later, something massive came crashing down from it,